Be strong.
After that, he and the group went home to rest, sending good night wishes to those who remained. What she said was heard by Durgu. The next morning at the academy, someone's voice inside asked something, but it echoed outside. Lihan heard Durgu come back to tell the story. His eyes lit up. He stroked his chin as if he had some kind of opportunity. If he listened to him, then I could go too. Seeing his friend showing such a resentful attitude, Durgu next to him spoke up to remind Lihan. The two of them felt helpless with his thoughts and seemingly incomprehensible expression. Durgu is worried. Seriously, after what happened to Giselle, how can you still say that? Hearing that, Lihan couldn't hear a word of it. He waved his hands and laughed loudly, advising his friend that no one would pay attention to such small things. He shyly said, I guess so, right? Yoner and Guy Nandu next to him shook their heads sadly. As he walked, he thought that this was trouble. On the outside, he was worried, but on the inside he was also a little worried when he heard the news from Durgu. At first he thought he planned to take the time to explore the exit, because it was obvious that based on the professor's personalities, escaping would be very difficult. But Marathi announced that he had a way out, making him really worried about what Professor Uragulm said. He looked at Guy Nandu and thought that Marathi was not as innocent as Guy Nandu. He was smart and cold enough to take advantage of the students in the same tower right from the beginning of the semester. He certainly had reason to be confident that he could escape. Lihan walked out of everyone's sight. Everyone behind him folded their arms and leaned against the wall, not knowing what he was thinking. Then he uttered one sentence, no way. He suggested Durgu, follow Marathi and find out what it was. Durgu shouted in surprise, what? Durgu helplessly asked if he was serious. Hearing that, Lihan seemed serious and suggested this. He asked Durgu if he had any better ideas. Durgu is helpless, don't you think that's a bit cowardly? The other two people crossed their arms in frustration and shook their heads without saying a word. Lihan didn't care about the cowardly plan and advised Durgu not to worry about it. Lihan turned around and asked, now we are facing each other. Durgu next to him confirmed that he was right. He continued to speak the truth. There is a very famous saying, know the enemy and know yourself. 100 battles will win. Durgu next to him only knows how to follow. He immediately placed his hand on Durgu's shoulder. Unexpectedly, Lihan not only gave up but also acted like a shining light, thinking that finding out how Marathi escaped was just a tactic. Durgu had beads of sweat on his neck, worried if it was because of his face. For some reason, even he felt it was right. The light shone on his face. I had to accept it. He closed his eyes and followed Lihan's words. I guess this can also be considered a strategy. Once again Lihan placed both hands on his shoulders. I knew he would understand, as if he put all his trust and determination in Durgu to do this despicable thing. Seeing that he had agreed with his plan to escape, he turned to Durgu and said, okay, from now on you will monitor Marathi. Meet me when you know his escape plan. He's such an excellent warrior, and a proud spy, whether Lihan is praising or criticizing him. He pushed Durgu out, as if urging him to do his duty. He said the signal. The mission began. His eyes sparkled, flattering Durgu. He would do well, right? Durgu breathed a sigh of relief. Then he clenched his fist to show his determination to complete the task. Well, just leave it to me. After saying that, Lihan immediately held the doorknob and closed it. He breathed a sigh of relief, saying that Durgu's part was over. I need to rethink my escape plan again. He turned around and saw Guy Nandu and Yoner behind him. He was surprised and wondered when these two people had become close. The two frowned, wanting to say something but stopped. They said, you, and said nothing more. Learn brainwashing magic before entering the academy, right? Lihan confidently answered, of course not. Han didn't listen to those two people's nonsense anymore. He turned and left. At this time, all four had fully appeared, including Yoner and Nelia. There's also Durgu and Guy Nandu. Seeing that everyone was gathered, Lihan spoke up, thanking everyone for attending the first escape planning meeting. Nelia suddenly became afraid. No matter how she escaped, she had to stop trying suddenly because do you know what this mission does? She approached and angrily scolded Lihan. Do you want to escape from the academy? You are crazy. She thought you were just hunting. Seeing Nelia's anger, he immediately explained not to worry, because he had a plan. Hearing that, she kept quiet and listened to what Lihan said. She thought that if it was Lihan, then from the Wardina's family, he would be completely different from everyone else. She immediately asked him what the plan was, and he quickly answered. A meme picture of Guy Nandu appeared. He didn't know where he got that picture from. He pointed at the picture and thought that the guy in the picture had a way to escape. He just needed to follow and imitate it. God, what a plan that couldn't have been worse, Nelia gasped helplessly. He made her think that was his plan. Nelia didn't know what to say. She closed her eyes and called Li Han's name. Seeing that, Yoner immediately told her that this plan could not succeed without Nelia. Seeing that, Li Han immediately walked forward to say something. He placed his hand on his chest and gently said after Yoner, what he wanted was the same, he couldn't do without Nelia. Seeing that, Goner immediately stopped her, seeing that this was going a bit far. Navigation ability and hunting instinct are the keys to the plan. Nelia is the only one who possesses both. Hearing that, Nelia also understood somewhat. Her eyes also showed that she would follow the person on this mission. But Yoner suddenly turned around, said it was impossible to force love, and expressed regret, while Li Han felt disappointed when he saw that she didn't really want to do it. Seeing that the two of them were at odds, she crossed her arms and sulked back, whatever. She was proud that if only she could do it, it would be over. Giselle with her bright eyes turned down and said, tonight. She called out to her esteemed comrades. And called the knights who vowed to follow her orders. Giselle called out to them from the cliff, to escape the academy together tonight. Everyone was visibly excited, everyone agreed with Giselle about this escape. Giselle decided to give the order to go. She took out a map from her pocket, which was what made it impossible for her to fail. From somewhere came a voice saying to introduce magic to new people. Someone asked again, then that person spoke about the legend of Einrogard. A hand dropped the pile of papers, the person wondered if this was all. The two servants' faces darkened and they admitted their fault. It was Lady Giselle at the Marathi house 1 month before the entrance exam. She kicked the pile of books hard, thinking that these things were useless. Her two servants apologized profusely and took the books away. Suddenly Giselle realized something. She picked up a piece of paper from the ground, curious as to what it was. Giselle opened it and was extremely surprised. That was the map to escape from Einrogard, on which was written the escape route left by a senior. She smiled with satisfaction, because she had bought this map and thought that everyone would eventually come to this point. And that was the reason this map was created. She remembered Principal Osu Gon adults with anger. Back to reality, in the forest where Giselle's group is standing. There is a group of night watchmen on patrol. There was the sound of someone signaling everyone to move. Li Han Wardanus thought that if they went inside the mountain, they probably wouldn't take the normal route. Then he asked if everyone was ready. When people heard that, they wondered why they went into the mountain because climbing the mountain was very difficult. Guy Nandu mentions the door near the castle gate. Suddenly Li Han told Durgu to handle Guy Nandu. When he heard he was being treated, he was extremely confused and didn't understand what was going on. Li Han mentioned Nelia's ability to spy on the mountain. As for himself and Durgu, they can endure it well. He also mentioned Yoner, who used to collect herbs so mountains were no problem for her. Then he hesitated. This makes Guy Nandu extremely difficult to understand. A moment later, Guy Nandu was being carried on Durgu's shoulders, his face dark with thirst. Li Han next to him said he was not used to this. Then he wiped away the sweat, secretly feeling the difficulty of having to follow through the strange mountain path. Li Han thought about how if Nelia wasn't here, it wouldn't be possible to follow them. As for him, he blamed himself for not being able to do anything and took out a blank piece of paper from his pocket. Li Han smiled wryly and wrote something on paper, and this was the note-taking habit of college students. Suddenly, something startled Nelia. She signaled everyone to stop. He wondered what was going on. Nelia saw that the animals were acting strangely and didn't understand why they stopped. Guy Nandu thinks that he has arrived and this is easier than he thought. Li Han couldn't believe he had arrived because this was so easy. Suddenly, there was a strong wind blowing through the forest. Something made Li Han shiver. He was surprised and couldn't speak. After that, he shouted loudly, not understanding what this chilling feeling was about. Some people wondered if it was a monster, but Nelia disagreed because she had already checked for monsters around. Li Han he hesitated for a long time. His face was pale with fear, worried about whether it was. A green flame appeared from nowhere, accompanied by a savage laugh from Principal Osu Gon adults. That blue light surrounded the group of people. Everyone didn't understand what was happening, so they were extremely scared. They were surrounded and gathered in a circle, surrounded by the same blue smoke but increasingly denser. A hand appeared out of thin air, pointing straight at the group of people. Principal Osu Gon adults appeared, and said that in just the first week, they were trapped. Everyone was frightened when they saw him, everyone's face turned pale with fear. Principal Osu Gon adults pointed at Giselle and laughed at her for buying the fake map he smuggled out. Giselle didn't believe it, this was Kettle because she bought it before entering school. The map in her hand gradually disappeared, leaving confusion in her heart. Principal Osu Gon adults thinks they learned a valuable lesson today. That is, do not trust maps of unknown origin because it will be impossible to distinguish between a treasure map and a trap of an evil lich. Then, he laughed loudly, while Giselle was extremely disappointed. She couldn't stand anymore and sat down on the ground. Li Han was no better, he was scared and scolded him for being crazy and thought he was just toying with the students. After that, Principal Osu Gon adults extended his hand and told them to return. From his mouth, thicker smoke came out. He created pursuers for his students to walk back and forth while avoiding their attacks. Principal Osu Gon adults allows them to use any means, even defeating them and returning alive. But if they are caught, they will be considered guilty. Then, he exhaled the last breath of smoke, then closed his mouth. He joked, winking, and advised the students that if they were not arrested, they would be considered innocent. The students panicked and ran away while screaming. Those three skeletons just looked after those people without chasing them. Nelia was trembling, behind the bushes witnessing everything. Nelia then turned around in fear and said loudly, "What are you doing? Run away." Seeing that Nelia was about to run away, he immediately grabbed Nelia's hand. Signal for silence, then lower your voice to reassure, "Calm down, Nelia." She was still shaking all over, her face pale, saying, "How can we calm down? We could die if we get caught." He hid there, constantly reassuring her that it would be okay, but those words of reassurance didn't seem to make Nelia feel any better. He continued to say, "I don't think they discovered us, even if they did, at most, they could only lock us in a room and use physical punishment." While Nelia listened to you talk, those skeletons kept looking for their whereabouts. When she heard this, Nelia was extremely scared, there was no blood left on her face, she trembled and asked about physical punishment. A series of tortured images appeared in Nelia's head. Li Han heard that and said, her imagination was terrifying. After saying that, he went nearby to observe the skeletons. At Nelia's side, Yoner came out to reassure them. Those skeletons kept walking in the place of the three of us. Seeing this scene, he wondered in his mind, why should we leave here now? While he was thinking about finding a way to leave, suddenly someone shouted, "Let's go in groups, we will take them down if we are chased." Hearing that, he couldn't help but turn his head to look in the direction of the sound. Those skeletons heard the sound and rushed up to attack the three people. They were still standing there talking loudly. "If you keep running, you won't get anything, just confront them." Among them were two guys who were extremely eager to fight. One of them said, "For honor." The blue-haired guy also replied, "For martial spirit." He looked at them and thought in boredom, why did they keep shouting about honor and martial arts? Suddenly, someone behind him called him, "Li Han." Durgyu walked over and patted his shoulder and told him, "I see, we only have one way out." He looked at two people, a man and a woman, in the distance, leaning back to fight together, and he thought to himself, we have to put aside the differences between the families and cooperate if we want to escape. Li Han nodded, he praised, "Excellent reasoning, Durgyu, okay." His eyes glowed excitedly and told him, "We will cooperate with these guys, by running away while they buy time." The other three people were quite excited and shouted, "Okay." Durgyu looked at that scene and looked at the three of them with a dark face and worry. He looked into the distance and said to the people here, "We will have to open a bloody path through the point where they have the least number of troops, but the tigers are really buying time, but..." Li Han hid behind the tree, he glanced at it, why were there no gaps at all? Suddenly he noticed that above his head the principal was emitting an aura and said loudly to everyone, "Don't say no." Seeing more and more skeletons, he wondered, is he still summoning more? He looked at the principal's actions and was extremely angry. With his own mouth he told us to escape, so I thought he was planning to test the students, something like that, but in the first place he didn't want to let us go. Li Han secretly cried in his heart, no, he's the one who thinks this is enough for us. He still hid right there, watching for a while, and then the three people were being carried away by the soldiers. Seeing that scene, he suddenly thought of an idea. Should he just surrender, just watch the group run around and be caught? Suddenly, I realized something. Wait, something was wrong. Seeing the soldiers keep going in one direction, Li Han thought to himself, the soldiers didn't pay any attention to this direction, but why? Then I looked up at the principal above who was engrossed in summoning. He didn't know we were here, the principal of Einrogard. He had a plan but was still a little scared. Wait, but just in case, he encouraged himself, it was just possible. He stood proudly, above the principal still hovering there. Li Han confirmed that the principal was really not here. It was the same when people first discovered it. He continued to ask the question in his mind, if it was just a clone or an illusion of the principal, we just need to run back to the White Tigers and be done with it. Li Han turned back and told them, you guys have thought of a way to escape. They were happy, excited, shouting, really? After that, he said loudly, just move forward, let's go. In the end, they all followed Li Han. 30 minutes later they went deep into this forest. Nelia then turned back to report that the inspection had been completed and there were no traces of monsters detected. When Li Han heard that, he immediately raised his wand. Oh, light emitted from the wand. The light he had just created illuminated the entire cave. Yoner stood up to dry his coat, while Yoner turned around and asked, those bones couldn't have come all the way here, right? Hearing that, Nelia immediately shook her head to reassure her friend, it will be okay, I don't see any signs, they are after us. He sat nearby and heard Nelia say that and immediately said, the problem is how long it will take them to be summoned. He said with a rather dazed expression, maybe I should have just cut my way through them. Li Han closed his eyes, holding the cloth bag in his hand, slowly speaking to Durgu that it was impossible to overcome what was clearly a difficult problem to solve. After saying that, he took out a string of sausages and smiled, but for now, just eat it. The blonde friend next to you saw that and agreed. Nelia planned to drink some water to ease her dry throat, but unfortunately she was done talking. Nelia immediately complained, "Die, I'm out of water." He saw that Nelia was out of water and immediately cast a spell, causing waves to rise and a small stream of water to appear. Nelia was surprised. She exclaimed, "Water magic." She had only heard rumors about it. It was better than she thought. Immediately after that, Nelia picked up the water bottle and thought to herself, it must be very interesting. It will also help me on my hunts, if I know how to use it. Yoner sat shaking, holding his bag. Could someone light a fire? It was too cold, Nelia saw. Seeing that, Nelia immediately used magic, and a blazing fire immediately appeared. Yoner immediately praised, "Wow, that's really great." Nelia heard that and Nelia just laughed. "Thank God it worked the first time I tried it, before it was super unstable." Nelia glanced at him with envious eyes. Honestly, I was more jealous of Li Han's water magic. I wanted the water element more than fire. The bread in his hand was grabbed tightly and broken in half. Li Han cried with joy, "What? You're jealous of my water magic?" Nelia next to him was scared, stammering and asking, "What are you doing all of a sudden?" After he said a few words, tears flowed down like waterfalls and he trembled as he said to Nelia, "Nelia, you should be grateful for possessing your magic. That's an overreaction." Nelia, "Oh yeah, two to finish, story." After refueling, the two of them, along with Nelia, went outside and stood on the rock to observe below. Li Han gently scolded the principal to let Nelia hear that. At first, she agreed, but later, she panicked and asked him if it was okay to insult him. Li Han put his hand on Nelia's shoulder calling her name, Nelia. He confidently told her that magic is nurtured from an open mind, so you should never limit yourself by the way you express yourself. Nelia heard his words so inspiring that she panicked and thought, wow, the words coming out of his mouth sounded strangely convincing. With a bit of motivation, Nelia is much more aggressive. Then, "You bad principal." Nelia immediately walked ahead and said, "You stupid skull, I hope the wolf will eat you at night." While in the mood, suddenly a dark shadow appeared behind Nelia, causing her to startle and scream loudly, "Ah, I'm sorry," and then rushed towards him. He was calmer than Nelia observed the other direction. He was. That person continued walking and asked, "What are you guys doing here?" The figure in the bushes gradually appeared. It turned out that this acquaintance or young man must have been lucky to escape from the principal's hands. When Nelia saw the two of them, she was somewhat less afraid. A moment later, Li Han's hand carefully lifted the curtain. He stood in front of the cave where a group of 4 people including Nelia, Guy Nandu, Durgu and Yoner were sitting, holding out his hand to invite Lady Giselle's group to enter. Seeing that they were still wary, Li Han continued to invite them to rest a bit. Inside the cave, Guy Nandu chewed his food while whispering to his green friend next to him, "We don't even have anything to eat, why is he?" Durgu heard his friend say that and immediately nodded. Remind Guy Nandu to be quiet. Durgyu closed his eyes and thought about the situation. Li Han had the right to ignore the people who had just arrived here, because of what they had done to Li Han. At this time Durgyu looked at Li Han thoughtfully helping the group of people who had just arrived and commented, but instead he treated them kindly like this. Durgyu finds Li Han admirable, and also a person who truly respects honor. Lady Giselle's eyes were now fixed on the two Yoner and Durgyu sitting in front of her. She was thinking in her heart, why are those bastards belong here, don't tell me. They also found the map. In Giselle's mind, she couldn't imagine that they could follow her. Looking at her reflection inside the cup, Giselle worried about what to do next, now that she received help like this. She hesitated and wondered what she should do, when a subconscious voice rang out, "Don't forget Giselle." The image of Giselle as a child standing with a blonde man appeared. She remembered Lord Marady's motto, "Don't forget any grudges," but there was a hidden meaning in that statement. His face was sinister and he continued, "That is." Marady pointed to the idea, kindness is only rewarded when you remember it. Giselle quickly revealed a mischievous smile. She decided to first build trust with Li Han. Giselle took the initiative to smile and talk to him. "Li Han, what's the matter?" The words had not yet ended when suddenly there was a thud, and Giselle's pale teammate in the group collapsed. Guy Nandu cried out in panic, What? Durgyu also said in panic, "Why did he suddenly collapse?" The horned teammate rubbed the back of his green teammate who had just collapsed and said, "Probably because he was so tired." Suddenly, just a split second later, two guys standing nearby froze with their mouths watering. They quickly collapsed in front of Lady Giselle. She couldn't believe it and exclaimed, "What the hell is going on?" Right after that, she quickly looked towards Li Han questioningly, "Don't tell me." Li Han's face showed a sinister look, which also seemed to explain the strange thing that had just happened. He poured down the watery cup and told Giselle. Unfortunately, he realized it too late. Giselle rubbed her head and drowsily said, "Poison her drink." At this time, her face had turned 7 points gray, but her mouth was still filled with hatred as she muttered, "You won't be able to escape, or Danaz." After speaking, Giselle quickly collapsed due to the effects of that drug. Li Han's face bloomed. He clasped his hands together and clapped happily, saying, "It's done, so the preparations are complete." After speaking, he raised his hand to rub Giselle's blonde hair, feeling a bit shaken. "It seems a bit too much, but if someone hates me for no reason, I should give them a reason, right?" At this time, two people, Guy Nandu and Durgyu, partly understood the problem. They shouted in panic, "What is it, Li Han? Did you put poison in the water? I also drink it." Yoner and Nelia chuckled and explained, "Don't worry, they're just sleeping, and we didn't poison the water." Guy Nandu suddenly exclaimed, "You guys also know that." Li Han waved his hand to explain when he heard that, "It was because your expressions were too obvious." Looking at the person sleeping on the ground, Li Han reassured himself that he wouldn't do anything like this just for personal reasons. This was necessary. Li Han bent down and said to his teammates, "Everyone calm down, we have to leave them near the wanted people." Durgyu saw that Li Han had begun to carry Giselle on his shoulders and couldn't believe it and asked him if it was true or not. Li Han asked Durgyu if he knew Marady's personality, right, making Durgyu's face turn pale. However, Durgyu continued to grumble, "But where did you guys find the medicine?" Yoner replied, "That." The scene appears when Li Han and Yoner are walking in the forest and she exclaims, "Oh, look, that's rosemary." It is a type of herb with long and large leaves that turn in many directions. Li Han found it strange and asked Yoner about this plant. She explained that it was a plant that has a sleepy effect when crushed and mixed with water. Li Han suggested taking a little for when needed. Yoner put her hand on her chin and thought again. She didn't think she would use that type of rosemary plant like this. Giselle's teammates are still sleeping and haven't woken up yet. Suddenly a blue light appeared. A group of people came and carried them away, successfully capturing them. Li Han and his teammates stood on the cliff watching. He assured everyone, "Okay, they will disperse soon." "Come on, now we should finish the remaining work," Yoner asked confusedly. "What work?" Li Han replied, "Scouting the surrounding area. We can't go back once we've come this far." He thought to himself, if there really is a way to escape, at any cost. While thinking, Durgyu called out, "Let's go together, Li Han." Just like that, the whole group walked along the forest path together. Suddenly, Guy Nandu's footsteps hit a stone slab. Guy Nandu shouted, startling Yoner and turned to look. Seeing him slipping down, she panicked and shouted, "Guy Nandu!" Li Han turned back to ask Gai Nandu if he was okay, but at this moment Gai Nandu was very miserable, tired and complaining of hunger and pain. Li Han looked at Durgyu's expression and guessed that Durgyu was starting to get tired at this point. Nelia looked towards the distant tree and asked her teammates to light up the light, because their group had gone far but not being captured meant they were safe. Nelia added that she finds people get exhausted more easily than usual when in the dark. Li Han worriedly looked at Gai Nandu collapsed in front of him, hesitantly called out, Then he quickly waved his hand high, a beam of light appeared, lighting up the entire area. Seeing the scene clearly, Yoner and Li Han's moods also became more comfortable. Li Han breathed a sigh of relief. Li Han continued his journey, walking quickly. Suddenly, from somewhere, a voice rang out telling him to turn off the light because it was making it difficult for that person to sleep. Nelia and Durgyu cried out in panic, What is that? But at this time, all they got in response was silence. Li Han looked up at the huge tree that was making the sound. I was the one asking the question here. At this time, the whole group looked up and listened as the tree continued to speak. If you answer correctly, you will be my guests. If you answer incorrectly, then you are just uninvited people. I read this. Your face looks worried and waiting. Then the tree started asking questions. A dwarf lit 5 candles late at night, but 2 of them were extinguished by strong winds. Angry, the dwarf stood up and closed all the windows in the room, thus leaving as many candles burning. Li Han thought for a moment. He quickly realized it was a trick question. He reasoned that the listener would think there were 3 candles still burning, but the flames would gradually go out as time passed. Suddenly Gai Nandu loudly answered 3, interrupting his train of thought. Hearing that, Li Han's sweat dropped in panic and said, Wait Gai Nandu, but at this time the tree spoke again, That's right. This stunned him and left him with many question marks. Li Han stammered out his theory while Gai Nandu was still snorting proudly. When the candles burned out, the fire would be extinguished. The tree theorized that it was common sense to use enchanted candles so they wouldn't burn out in such puzzles. Li Han immediately snorted and cursed after hearing this. The magical world was filled with smoke. The tree continued to say, From now on Li Han's group would be the tree's guests, but the tree didn't want it to end just like that. The tree offered to give one more riddle. The person who could answer would receive its gift. Li Han was excited when he heard about the gift, declaring himself ready. Hearing the tree begin to say the second riddle, Gai Nandu patted his chest proudly and said, This time let me answer. Yoner also excitedly exclaimed, I tried to. The second question asked, There was a giant man in the morning, but by noon he had shrunk again. In the afternoon he grew again, and in the evening he completely disappeared again. Ask who that man is. After hearing the whole group, they were a bit confused. Nelia closed her eyes and thought, Who could it be? Yoner replied, I don't know either. At this time, Li Han pointed to his chest, preparing to give an answer. Li Han replied that it was a shadow. The tree quickly agreed with the answer and said it was correct, causing his teammates to gasp in admiration. Gai Nandu asked why Li Han knew. In his mind, he thought about Gai Nandu's question. The truth was that he had heard that sentence quite a few times in his previous life. That is the answer that Oedipus, king of Thebes, gave correctly. Although each time the story is told, a few details will change, but the answer people give to the Sphinx always remains the same. Li Han put his hand on his chin and thought that the puzzles were always the same no matter where he was or what. The tree praised him. What a bright student. Suddenly something happened that made him freeze. Huge blue lights flew towards the group with a welcome here. Immediately afterwards, sparkling yellow butterflies appeared and flew around the group. Yoner excitedly exclaimed, Wow, these are all miscellaneous things. The tree branch was wrapped around a wooden bucket and then brought in front of Li Han. In the wooden cup is currently holding a green water. The kind tree said, You must be tired from the long journey, drink this. Li Han took the wooden cup of water and said thank you, but his expression showed concern. He clicked his tongue. It smelled like vegetable juice. He reluctantly took a sip. Li Han exclaimed, This thing, it feels like all the fatigue in my body has just been relieved. It's like a cool glass of water. After just coming back from jogging on a hot summer day, Li Han's face now showed a feeling of comfort and satisfaction. Gai Nandu opened his mouth in uncontrollable enjoyment, took the wooden cup and shyly said to Yoner, The smell was so strange. Yoner also replied, Is it okay to drink it? The tree said to Li Han, It's a drink extracted from plants around here. Do you like it? Li Han clenched his fists excitedly and complimented it on how great it was and offered to drink more. The tree quickly used a branch to bring another wooden cup. Li Han stretched out his hand to take it. But at this time the tree quickly retreated and asked about his identity. He introduced himself as Li Han. The tree asked Li Han, what was the family name? Li Han replied, Wardinas. The tree exclaimed in shock, what? He helplessly smiled bitterly because even the tree heard about it. The tree immediately said sorry, it was just because of the rumors about his family. When Li Han heard that, his eyes widened in curiosity. The tree continued, but based on the way he said his name first instead of his family's name, it surmised he would become a great magician. But what are you guys doing here so late at night? Hearing this, Gai Nandu couldn't help but spit out water, and Li Han trembled. He placed his hand on his chest, confidently declaring that they were just going for a night walk. Yoner stood behind him and reminded him to wipe his saliva away first. The tree questioned them, are you trying to get out of the academy? But it's only been a week since you joined, why are you planning to escape already? Li Han put his hand on his mouth and said, we have our own personal reasons. Dear spirit, can you give us some advice? At this time, Durgyu was complaining to Nelia about the taste of that blue water, and Nelia was playing with butterflies. The tree replied to Li Han that although there was a way out, new students could not use it. Li Han helplessly continued asking, in that case, can you tell us where the academy wall ends? The tree refused to answer because it was top secret. Besides, those city walls are already enchanted, so if you don't touch them carefully, you will suffer a lot. Li Han clenched his fists in his hands, disappointed that the way to escape along the wall was impossible. The tree reminded him that at this time, he should not try to escape outside. Although everything is going smoothly now, in just a few weeks the monsters will begin to awaken. Li Han bowed his head and thanked the tree. The tree saw and the tree judged. Looking at Li Han, there was no sign of discouragement, even sharper than before because he was thinking more. He thought it would be interesting to observe Li Han, then suddenly he remembered and said to him, oh yes, I said I would give you a gift. Li Han froze without having time to think. A hole opened from the tree canopy. Li Han gasped in surprise. A glowing wooden stick fell down. Li Han remembered the first time he met Garcia Kim. Her face was happy, which helped him know that the main artifacts were the magician's hands and feet and the staff was the most important. When his eyes moved to his friends, each of them held their wands in their hands, clearly disappointed. It seemed like they were not satisfied with what they received. But contrary to them, a miracle happened to Li Han that very day. He became the first freshman to receive a new staff. Gai Nandu and Nelia approached him with eyes wide open. Even the main Li Han's eyes widened in surprise, seeing the reaction of such a group of people. The person who gave him the staff wondered if is it okay. I only saw from the staff a gentle blue light radiating everywhere, penetrating straight into Li Han's body, making him feel like he was in the clouds, extremely comfortable and fresh. The old tree was surprised after hearing what Li Han said. It looked at him a little more, but what it saw was just a curious Li Han looking at the staff, not knowing when it had grown more leaves. In its heart, it was happy to know that he was an unusual person, fully met its expectations. From the staff, streams of blue power appeared more and more densely, and the foliage from before had also disappeared. The tree understood what had just happened. It was happy just now, but now it is full of regret for Li Han because he committed some mistake that displeased the soul residing in the staff. It was like that for a while then stopped. Li Han held it in his hand without knowing how to use it, so he asked for help, but the tree refused because it knew Li Han would be able to use the power sources residing in the staff, guide you. His face was sad and unhappy as he stared at the staff. Seeing Li Han like that, the staff only knew how to comfort and encourage him to naturally learn how to use it over time. Seeing him still so sad, he could only smile and say nothing, because he believed that with his natural talent, Li Han would succeed. Contrary to the gloomy appearance on his face, in Li Han's mind was the image of a man laughing maniacally. The words of the success tree reminded him of the lunatic of the Wodanas family, the man he met centuries ago, and everything was as Li Han expected from Wodanas' blood. The next morning, the group of friends gathered in front of the tree, watching the group of people wandering around exploring, some teasing flowers to catch butterflies, others studying plants. The old tree realized it was time for them to return. The tree said goodbye to them and then controlled the winds to take everyone out of the forest. Gai Nandu cowardly cried and screamed in fear. The two girls in the group also raised their voices in surprise. Even Li Han was very surprised when he was moved like that. Li Han panicked and didn't know how to get out of this place. It reminded him not to use magic around these buildings because his magic was too strong. The force awakened the surrounding trees. As he finished speaking, Li Han's group was thrown out of the forest. They all fell face down on the ground. Only Dorgyu successfully landed with the posture of a hero. Gai Nandu struggled to sit up, her bruised face groaning. The two girls Nelia and Yoner behind her were also bruised, their clothes dirty. Suddenly the voice of the old tree appeared again, reminding Li Han to remember the question he had asked. That reminder surprised him. Before saying goodbye to his friends, he left Li Han one last word, implying that the previous question was the answer for the future. After hearing it, he staggered to his feet and looked towards the forest. Going a little further away from the soul's territory, something strange appeared. The zombies that surrounded the forest completely disappeared. It happened like a dream. Li Han and the others walked and talked, and soon they went down the mountain. After an exciting expedition, Li Han was exhausted and dragged his tired body to bed. At this moment, outside the hallway, someone was running very quickly. As he ran, that person called Li Han's name. When he arrived in front of his room, there was another pounding on the door, causing Li Han, who was relaxing on the bed, to suddenly wake up. Li Han's lifeless face opened the door. Even though his hair was messy and his eyes were dark like a panda's, Li Han looked at the person in front of him, wondering what was going on. The person who came was Ashan Dalkard. Her face was panicked, but she still knew how to apologize for her rudeness. He panicked and remembered the principal smiling happily, then summarized the current situation outside, where there was an event organized by him. Hearing that, Li Han's face was so surprised that he woke up from sleep. His words made Li Han wake up. He remembered the time when he and his friends tried to escape from school. From that memory, he had a guess that he was trying to follow the students who were plotting to escape. After thinking about it, Li Han's face became more serious, because he thought he should act more seriously in situations like this. Li Han was friendly and told his classmates that he would wake everyone up and go there later. Outside the schoolyard was extremely bustling, with a bustling stream of people, banners hanging everywhere, colorful confetti everywhere. This place had the perfect atmosphere of a festival. Li Han's friends and him also arrived. Li Han felt it wasn't like an attempt to follow after the escape, but actually felt like a festival, he thought as he turned to talk and laugh happily with a girl who was offering cake. Holding the half-bitten piece of cake, Li Han continued to wonder what people were plotting, thinking of a certain situation where he mumbled the word yes continuously. There was a loud noise on the stage, causing the students to pay attention. 3 women appeared, and the principal also clapped happily. His head was wearing an orange birthday hat, his face was cheerful, his hands were clapping continuously, attracting everyone's attention. He continued to encourage everyone to clap. The figures on the stage became clearer. The principal introduced those people as monks from all over the empire visiting the academy. Li Han stood below and applauded enthusiastically. In his heart he was evaluating the principal's party. The eldest of the monks stood up, with a friendly face, to thank Headmaster Osu Gona Daltz on behalf of the group, who also thanked her for devoting her time to the academy even though she was busy enough in school, teaching young students here. When he heard her praise, he looked embarrassed like a young girl. The principal smiled lightly. He was so happy that he felt like he had fallen in love with the monks. Suddenly he thought of something. His eyes lit up, his pupils turned into golden coins. He asked her if she could convey a message to His Majesty the Emperor to ask for some funding for the project of discovering ancient magic. Standing in front of that light that was brighter than a car's headlights, she panicked. Because it was not her right to do so, she awkwardly refused, and the person behind her also covered her face and turned away. Li Han knew what he wanted to do as soon as he saw it, the scene of a bald man talking to someone flatteringly. He saw that the scene now was the same as then. No matter what, everyone will also act in the same way to ensure budget. Medrid stood back to the side, trying to break this awkward atmosphere, trying to express his goodwill when meeting the students, while the principal was frustrated. After saying that, Medrid introduced his companions. The 3 of them were all servants representing different churches, very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce religion today. Li Han, as soon as I heard it, I knew they were not ordinary monks. The more Li Han looked at them, the more strange they became. They all had a large amount of mana, a green power surrounded them. Li Han was immersed in the difference between their mana and the other monks, not paying attention to the principal who had appeared with interest, looking in the same direction as him. The principal's words brought Li Han out of his thoughts. He looked startled and wondered when the principal had appeared there. He didn't care and just raised his hand twice. It seemed he also knew what he was thinking, giving Li Han the answer that the monk's mana was so special that it was called divine power. Li Han finally understood what his strange feeling was, but the principal noticed him and asked if he could probe for mana. As expected, it was his question that made Li Han speechless and look away with fear on his face. Unable to hide it anymore, Li Han took the initiative to say that he felt he had many shortcomings, but after listening, the principal just sighed and encouraged Li Han not to be like that. He should confidently show off his talent. Looking at his attitude, the principal knew he guessed right. He wondered why Li Han hid it because it was very rare and not many people had it. But Li Han didn't understand what he wanted and looked terrified. He just looked at the monk who didn't know when he got off the stage, and was giving bread to two students nearby. After listening, the principal was not too surprised because Li Han was from the wardena's family. He sighed. Hearing what he said, Li Han wondered. He explained that because people like him were not interested in faith, they were too wise to believe in gods. He remembered his father's words that his divine power was just a product of fanatical faith, including the rumors about his family. Li Han was even more certain that his family hated monks. In his mind, the scene of two monks being kicked out of the wardena's family mansion appeared in his mind. From there, a determination arose in his heart to keep his family's name hidden from the monks. Seeing the principal sigh again over something, it turned out to be because he felt pitiful for these monks because they had gone to the extent of creating a festival for a bunch of useless students who only cared about food. He looked thoughtfully at the fresh cakes placed on the table. Li Han's eyes were now full of cakes. He called out to the principal. An idea appeared in his mind. Li Han pointed to himself and asked the principal's opinion to see if he suggested any beliefs. After listening to what he said, his eyes were filled with hate, wondering if what he had just said had reached Li Han's ears or not. However, very quickly, the principal's eyes widened in surprise, pausing for a moment to remember what Li Han said. Faith, I was planning to join a multi-faith organization. He didn't believe it and asked again, only to see Li Han looking at the principal seriously. Li Han didn't answer yet, but just smiled with a sunny smile. His hands trembled as he looked at the smiling Li Han in front of him. He was quite impressed even though some time had passed. In the principal's mind, an evil Li Han looked down at the group of students offering him food, wondering if he was going to join the group and take everything or what. The principal was speechless, opening his mouth not knowing what to say. But very quickly he was happy again, his face excited, because for him, Li Han was an interesting person, and he liked that. Looking at the bustling festival scene before him, the principal pondered for a moment. He finally responded to Li Han's question. He suggested the Precinct of Faith. It was a group with a belief in self-sacrifice, so they would definitely welcome Li Han. It wasn't just him. The principal suggested another religion, which was the Caliso religion, a religion that worships a god who loves chaos and change. They didn't care if he believed in other pure gods or not. He introduced another belief. This time it was the Capolio belief. They worshipped the sword god, a saying full of meaning. And maybe they will welcome a strange boy like Li Han. His words succeeded in causing Li Han, who was taking notes, to stop, his face confused and worried, afraid that the principal knew what he was doing. Learn swordsmanship. Thinking about that case, he was terrified and remembered that in the past, a professor who liked him so much told him to come to his room after class, and Li Han didn't like that at all. He didn't like impressing the professor. But Li Han quickly got out of his thoughts. The principal looked up at the sky and announced that he had to leave. Seeing that, Li Han politely thanked him for his suggestion. In his heart, the principal expected Li Han to make the right decisions. If he didn't need to go see the students being held in the punishment room, he would stay. Seeing that the principal really had to go, Li Han said, "Bye." Li Han's eyes widened in wonder when he heard him say something. He even thought he was lost, but when he raised his head, the principal had already disappeared. Turning back to the principal, his eyes lit up. Before many students playing games disappeared into thin air, a female student saw the principal looking back in bewilderment. Li Han spread his legs, looked suspiciously at the principal's disappearing figure, wondering in his heart whether he was talking about those people. He just stood there doubting life, mentally reminding himself to be more careful, when suddenly from behind someone reached out and called his name. That person was none other than Yoner. She brought a basket full of cakes to Li Han and asked him where he was going. Li Han stopped his thoughts and approached her, saying his intention to go to Priscinga's group instead of an answer. Yoner was surprised to hear what he said, not knowing when his friend became interested in them. He added that he planned to visit Caliso to visit Capilep. That statement was successful, making Yoner smile awkwardly to show that he understood. Before Li Han left, his attention caught the basket in her hand. Looking at it for a moment, Li Han wondered what it was. Yoner also looked at her hand and remembered something. From the basket, Yoner took out a delicious sandwich and gave it to Li Han. He was surprised and asked her where she got it from. Yoner replied, that cake was taken from the Flemane cult, a small group of people who worship the god of alchemy, Yoner said while remembering the extremely friendly monks. Yoner put her hand in front of her chest to form a coin shape, implying that her family had donated a lot of money to them before, so they recognized her first. After listening, he stepped back, his face as surprised as enlightenment. He couldn't help but wonder if what Yoner said was true, and could it happen? Li Han knew it was true. He clenched his fists, his face indignantly wondering why his family did not support any faith. Yoner looked at his appearance and thought why he was like that. Li Han cried a little in his heart and told Yoner he would go first because he was quite busy. Yoner didn't force him anymore and said goodbye. On the side of a certain tent, there were two nuns standing and talking to each other. But someone suddenly appeared and interrupted that conversation. The person who had just arrived was none other than Li Han. He smiled amicably, clearly showing his intention to learn about the god Prisinga. The two nuns saw Li Han's studiousness and couldn't believe their eyes. They were as happy as if they had found gold and welcomed him warmly. Li Han also responded enthusiastically, showing that he had been interested in learning for a long time. At this moment, two students passed by and looked at him with judgmental eyes, wondering why Li Han was there. However, neither the nun nor the boy cared. A nun stood at the door, put her hand into the tent and pointed in a certain direction. The nun then turned in a certain direction and called for help from a person named Digiling, only to see that person respond and come forward. Seeing who came, Li Han was surprised. The person who came had two small horns that stood out against his pink hair. His face was shy, his eyes were black and his pupils seemed to have fire inside. The person who arrived was a beautiful girl shyly holding a large bag of bread in her chest. The girl walked up to the nun and gave the bag of bread to that person. Li Han still stood aside, stunned at the appearance of that half-demon. Realizing that, Li Han began to remember what he knew about this race, which is the rarest race when it comes to hybrids, because if there is anyone whose ancestors made a contract with the devil, there is a possibility of in the descendants that will be affected. People will be isolated by appearance. So at that moment he had the answer to why they were often so passive and shy. At this moment, the nun remembered that Li Han was also there. She stepped aside and introduced her hand. It turned out that the girl's name was Digiling, a new student from the upper fire tower. The nun was also very surprised at Li Han's appearance. She did not expect that there was another believer besides Digiling. In the tent, statues of the god were neatly placed. After listening, Li Han expressed his respect. For him it was all natural for a person to believe in God Prisinga if they knew his noble will. Having finished speaking, Li Han opened his eyes and glanced at something, reminding himself that there were two important things to remember when joining the faith. In Li Han's heart, a scale appeared, considering what he had and not forgetting to consider what he had to do. His eyes moved to the small but very neat statue of the god. The more Li Han looked, the more he saw that this place was not very similar, but he quickly ignored it. Stepping deeper into the tent, Li Han was surprised to realize that there were many treasures and jewelry stacked inside. The entire pile was not ordinary jewelry or picture books but antiques, and Li Han could even see mana emitting from them. The more he looked, the more he wondered if the Prisinga religion was related to artifact making. Suddenly, from outside, a woman lifted the curtain and came in. The nun saw that and called out to Lady Medred. The woman saw someone in the tent and was extremely surprised, not thinking that anyone would voluntarily become a believer. Every step the woman took made the ground shake. Li Han was surprised to see the ground vibrate each time. Looking bewildered at the person approaching, Li Han was speechless and unable to say anything. On the ground were imprinted the footprints of the person who had just arrived. That person greeted Li Han. Finally, Medred stepped forward and gently greeted and introduced herself. Li Han's face was filled with embarrassment as he greeted her, while he was still surprised to see that Lady Medred's small body could leave traces on the ground. Looking at Mr. Medred's surprised face, she immediately guessed what he was thinking. She looked down at the shoes at her feet. It was not just an ordinary pair of shoes but an antique. She closed her eyes and stretched out her hands to reveal two strange bracelets on her wrists, which were also an artifact and could increase the weight of the wearer several times. Looking at the artifacts on Mrs. Medred's hands and feet, Li Han wondered why. Mrs. Medred did not answer immediately but put her hands to the sides with a satisfied expression. Everything she did was for Mr. Prisinga. Li Han looked at the scene in front of him speechless, his head full of question marks. He didn't understand the reason, so he asked again. They told him that it was the god Prisinga who bore the pain of the world alone. Surrounding the god Prisinga are countless chains, so as believers they must share that pain through wearing enchanted artifacts. After hearing that reason, Li Han sadly put his hand on his forehead and rubbed it a few times. At this moment, he deeply wondered why he believed the principal's words and came here. From his reaction, Medrid noticed his deep unwillingness. She understood, like many others, that Li Han did not want to go on this path because it was very arduous. As soon as he finished speaking, Li Han immediately turned around and left to take advantage while the request was still valid. Inside the tent, Mrs. Medrid took out a box and looked at it, sighing regretfully. That box was the gift she had prepared for him. She regretfully thought that even if it was an antique, not many people would want to carry that thing. It was an ancient artifact that absorbed mana. Her words were so successful that Li Han was stunned. When Li Han heard the words absorbing mana, his eyes widened in disbelief and he asked what charm was in his heart. Li Han remembered his conversation with Garcia Kim about the problem of him containing too much mana in this small body, so the curse on the artifact was really useful to him. Just thinking about that, Li Han turned his head immediately, panicked and asked Mrs. Medrid if there was anything else besides the curse. Realizing that his attitude was too hasty, Li Han calmed down and asked gently and slowly if something with a curse like it had any other abilities. Seeing Li Han's expression change in just a few short seconds, he was surprised and hesitantly spoke out about the remaining capabilities of the artifact in his hand. Just as any action has an opposite effect, the greater the power the artifact holds, the stronger the curse. She raised the box and looked at it with a smile. The artifact in Medrid's hand not only contained a curse that increased weight, but also a curse that increased holy power. Thinking for a while, she finally chose to tell him the remaining use. It turned out that the thing also had another effect, the invisibility spell hidden in it. Those words made Li Han step back in surprise. Fever. However, thinking about the downsides of that thing, even though wearing it had the effect of invisibility, the problem was that whoever wore it would absorb mana. She couldn't help but nervously glance to the side. Mrs. Medrid saw that Li Han seemed pensive and had her own answer. Just as she was about to put the box back, Li Han immediately placed his hand on it, wondering what she was talking about. Li Han placed one hand on his chest and the other on the box with a serious expression, but the happiness in his eyes could not be avoided. He was prepared for it. Hearing what he said, Medrid raised her hand to cover her face and couldn't believe her eyes. She silently thanked God for Singa in her heart. She thought he would leave. In Mrs. Medrid's eyes at this time, Li Han was a great person, making her feel ashamed for not realizing the sincere belief in Li Han's heart. Looking at the sparkling artifact in front of Li Han, he couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva. Invisible, he repeated that in his heart, happy when he picked up delicious things falling from the sky. Medrid raised her hand to wipe away the tears of happiness, her face showing satisfaction. She gave the box in her hand to Li Han, telling him to accept it and welcome him to her sect. She opened the box and a belt wrapped in purple mana appeared. Medrid introduced the belt as a sign of respect for Saint Frisinga. As soon as Li Han saw it, he knew it was the artifact in the words, "Speak." As soon as Li Han held that box in his hand, from both sides two nuns appeared with worried faces, looking at him warily. The two looked at each other and exchanged thoughts. It turned out that they were afraid that there would be side effects for new believers, and they thought this time would be no exception. And above all, be careful. Seeing the two nuns just standing there with no intention of doing anything else, Li Han took the belt out of the box and gently put it on her body. The belt was installed without anything happening. Li Han put it on and looked towards Medrid and asked her how to activate the invisibility magic. The two nuns behind her widened their eyes in surprise. They couldn't believe their eyes. He was the first case. One person even had to ask to confirm if Li Han felt anything strange. The violent reaction of the two nuns successfully made Li Han confused. He looked at Mrs. Medrid with a questioning look, his eyes clearly showing the words, "Is there a problem?" Realizing that he would be confused if he knew the truth, Medrid chose to shake her head and laugh it off, then showed him where the spell appeared. No one knew that her heart was filled with pride when the sect had an excellent disciple, Li Han. From the box, Li Han took out a piece of paper with mysterious words written on it. As soon as he looked at it, he immediately knew what it was. He read the instructions. The belt gradually turned into a cloak that covered Li Han's body. "Let me hide in the night" was the activation spell. Then in front of everyone, Li Han's figure magically disappeared. The nuns who saw it couldn't believe their eyes. It turned out it really worked. Li Han hasn't disappeared, he's still there, just invisible. He walked in front of the mirror and looked at his own image, which he could no longer see, then marveled at the effectiveness of this ancient artifact. It was not half-hearted, but invisibility was truly a powerful curse. Bored with playing, Li Han recited the spell again. "Let me appear in broad daylight," then appeared again in everyone's surprised eyes. Li Han raised his hand holding the paper and saw that the flow of mana was still very dense and fell into further contemplation. At this moment he really wondered if that belt was really cursed or not. Thinking for a moment, Li Han also realized where the problem was. He wouldn't feel anything if he didn't have more equipment. Just thinking about it, Li Han quickly turned to where Mrs. Medred was standing, expressing his desire to share more of the burden, bear with Saint-Frisinga. Mrs. Medred saw him like that, put her hand over her mouth and burst into tears of happiness. In her eyes, his actions were commendable. No matter how happy she was still very worried about his body and advised Li Han that it was still early to take it slow. However, he was very determined about what he wanted to do, and the two nuns who stood there were speechless. After a while, the two couldn't stand it anymore and had to scream to stop the argument. Li Han raised his hand to touch the purple mana-covered belt on his abdomen. He sat down on the chair and sighed, looking around, feeling frustrated when he couldn't get anything else. But as an optimistic person, Li Han quickly regained his original emotions. For him, this artifact was a useful item in escaping. His train of thought was interrupted when he heard Mrs. Medred preach about the event marking the birth of the sect. Mrs. Medred's lecture finally ended. She thanked him for listening. Li Han stood up and thanked him for the wonderful lecture. Li Han looked at the board full of words in front of him, silently recalling the doctrines, but it was not as important as equipping the cursed item. When she saw Li Han about to leave, Sister Medred raised her hand to stop him, and that caught his attention. She pulled out a basket filled with bread, fruit, cheese, and jam from somewhere and told Li Han to take it. Medred smiled and pressed it straight into his arms. This basket appeared because she thought Li Han would need it, so she deliberately prepared it. He saw Sister Medred's sincerity and didn't know what else to say. He received that basket with a satisfied smile on his face. Perhaps coming to the sect was the best thing to do today, because this place brought Li Han warmth that he hadn't felt in a long time. Suddenly, from behind, a hand gently poked his shoulder a few times. The owner of that hand is Digiling. She holds a similar basket in her hand and hopes Li Han can receive it. At a glance, Li Han knew that the basket in his hand was her share, which made him wonder even more why Digiling gave her share to him. I just saw her shaking her head and refusing to accept it, because in her heart Digiling felt that someone who worshipped Saint Frisinga like her did not deserve it. Not only Li Han, but even Sister Medred was worried about her actions, but as soon as she called her name, she quickly left. Digiling's refusal made Li Han suddenly look away, because at the Vermilion Tower, these things were completely normal. The longer Li Han stays here, the more he realizes the difference. The members of the towers will complain if there is no food, or plan to escape. Li Han held two baskets full of food in both hands and was about to walk home when he was once again stopped by Sister Medred. She softly asked if he could take care of Digiling because she was too strict with herself. Mentioning the difficult problem, Li Han, in order to avoid trouble, opened his mouth to refuse, saying that he did not belong to this tower. But who was Sister Medred? She lived long enough to know that matter determines consciousness. She brought a basket full of food before him. Holding a basket on his head, Li Han happily gave her a thumbs up. Before leaving, Li Han also affirmed that he would do his best to reassure her. The two of Li Han and Digiling walked and talked to each other. He politely asked if she agreed to let him call him by her nickname, but she only responded in a dismissive way. Seeing that the topic was gradually reaching a dead end, Li Han decided to ask about the situation about the Vermilion Tower. He wanted to know what the people there usually did in their free time. After hearing Mr. Digiling's question, her face turned red with embarrassment, because the actions we did were simply praying in the room from morning to night. Praying in the room is not all. According to Digiling, there are also people who go to the forest to pray at night. Hearing that, Li Han couldn't help but feel strange that going out at night was allowed, because Einrogard's dormitory had curfew rules all week except holidays. Hearing that, Digiling shook her head, because the tower where she lived had special status, so those actions were allowed. Li Han stared at her with a slightly embarrassed face. He realized that monks did not have to follow the same rules as him. An idea gradually flashed in Li Han's mind after those words. He planned to wear monk's clothes and go out at night. Thanks to that outfit, he could go out longer. Li Han with a bright, handsome face asked Digiling if he could own a monk's outfit. But this time, unlike last time, Digiling was no longer happy and glanced at him appraisingly. She looked at Li Han for a moment and then walked forward. As she walked, she told him that the monk's habit did not weaken the curse on Li Han. After hearing it, he was startled. Seeing that she misunderstood him, Li Han quickly chased after him, not forgetting to explain his actions because he just wanted to understand more about Saint Frisinga. She looked at him and sighed, promising to prepare an outfit for Li Han next time. Achieving his own goals, Li Han happily placed his hand on her shoulder, filled with evil thoughts. When the monk's robe arrived, the first step of the plan was completed. The two of them walked side by side on the deserted road. Li Han, no matter how happy he was, did not forget his duty and opened his mouth to ask her if the food was delicious and full. I only saw Digiling shaking her head a few times, closing her eyes with satisfaction. She was quite satisfied with everything. Even though she said so, Li Han was still worried and couldn't help but say frankly what Sister Medred had asked her to do. Her face became visibly quiet after those words. Afraid that Digiling would think too much, Li Han continued to express Sister Medred's concern for her. Afraid that she was more worried, Li Han proactively asked what to do now. Li Han wished Digiling could eat with him to avoid worrying Sister Medred. She did not say yes directly but also did not refuse, just asked if it was now or what. Li Han's footsteps stopped for a moment but very quickly the decision was made. Because to repay the person who gave him a basket full of food like this, Li Han no longer hesitated. But no one knew that he had an evil thought in his mind. With just one meal with Digiling, he could become the grandmother she met during the holidays, the one who gave her a lot of food.